So to start this warm light, cool shadow classic acrylic assignment, the first step is to take good photo reference that exhibits good light and shadow. The best time to get warm light, cool shadow, it's a natural phenomenon that goes out on the natural world, usually when the sunlight uh, gets down closer to the horizon lines. The light is filtering through all of the dust and smoke and atmosphere, and it creates a warmer light source. All right. And then the cool shadows come from the shadow surfaces or the top surfaces of the objects in shadow reflect the blue sky. And so that's what gives off the warm light and the cool shadows. But a lot of times we can't go and photograph those objects during that golden hour or that late evening lighting scenario. So we have to exaggerate. We have to understand that we are in control of the image and not be controlled by the image. So I'm going to use the simple object of an apple. It was shot indoors with a light source, one single light source. So it's nice and clear, it's nice and focused. But what I want you to do, and what I want, one of the main objectives of this assignment is not only just paint with acrylic and get familiar with acrylic, but I also want you to exaggerate colors. So in this light area of the apple, I want you to exaggerate those to be more warm. In the shadows of the apple and the cast shadow, I want you to exaggerate the cool temperatures or the cool colors. So you get a warm light, cool shadow scenario. And this one's all about, yes, painting with acrylic, but also exaggerating your colors and having fun with the temperatures. All right. So the first step is if you can go shoot an object, and again, I would keep your objects or your subject matter as simple as possible, especially if you've never painted with acrylics. So your first step is to take a really nice high quality photo. Then you're going to take that photo and do a drawing of it. And I would reserve the values for a later time. I would just focus on doing a line drawing. Yes, you can exaggerate, you can stylize, you can have fun with it. It doesn't have to be like the photo rendering assignment, but it can be a representation of your photo reference. So if you notice my photo reference here, and then you notice my drawing, you notice that the stem has been exaggerated and some of the shapes and everything like that. It's just now I'm using reference as reference and not copying it completely. So you can have a little bit of fun with it, but it should represent, your drawing should represent your subject matter or your photo reference. Okay. Obviously, we're doing a 7 by 10 format or image area. And I've just written some notes on my sketch for the purposes of keeping things in mind. And eventually I'll paint those out, or I might keep the notes. It might just be more like a sketch or a recording of what I'm trying to do image-wise. All right. The third step is to transfer your image onto a surface. Again, a 9 by 12 surface area, and then a 7 by 10 image area. So this is a piece of cold press illustration board, heavyweight, so it's a lot thicker, so it won't warp as fast as a lightweight illustration board. And it has a nice papered tooth, so it'll grab the acrylic paint a little bit better. You can use a wood surface like the wood panels that we've used in the past. Doesn't really matter to me. But for this demonstration, I'm going to use cold press illustration board. I used a photocopy transfer for this transfer, or you can use transfer paper or any means of transferring your image onto there. All right. The third step then Or the fourth step then would be to start the painting. And I will demonstrate that now. So if you remember and you should remember, the most important principles of acrylic painting are back to front, dark to light, thin to thick, large to small, and desaturated to saturation. All right, so here are my colors, my palette. Here's my water bucket. Get a couple of pieces of paper towel. And what I'm going to demonstrate is, right now I'm going to demonstrate the back to front principle in acrylic painting. So I know that I have my drawing on photocopy paper, and I can line that up and register it, and I can do multiple transfers just like in the other assignments that you've done. So I'm going to get that lined up, and I'm going to register it so that it is in the exact spot. And do the quick, I can see my line drawing is dark enough that I can see through the thin photocopy paper, and I can see that all of the lines line up and everything is good. So I'm going to do some registration marks here so that if I do need to, and I will need to, retransfer some of the information on there, because I'm going to be working in steps of back to front. At this point, I'm not worried about the apple and some of the foreground elements, because I know that I'm going to paint over those initially, and then I'll have to do a retransfer. So that's why I did the registration marks. And I'll just use transfer paper to redo those transfers. All right, so at this point, I've taken good reference, I've done a line drawing, I've transferred it onto a surface, and now I'm ready to paint. So again, I'm thinking about the second part of this assignment is warm light, cool shadow. So I'm going to start thinking about, if this part of my drawing is warm, I might want to do some cools in the background so those warms look more warm against the cools. And then if there's the shadow side of the apple is more cool, then I might want to do a gradation from warm to cool or cool to warm, so that whatever is framed, whatever temperature of the foreground object is framed by something behind it, it will look and it'll be more effective if it's the opposites. Okay, so I'm just going to have fun doing a little bit of painting. I'm going to thin the paint way down. So if I was to give it a percentage, I might think about 50% acrylic and 50% water. So it's a little bit more like a watercolor. Okay, and I'm starting with saturated colors on my palette right now, but I'm going to play around with getting some desaturated colors. And you'll get to explore and have fun with doing whatever you want with those colors. Now, if I look at my photo reference, I'll scoot it over here a little bit. I can tell that for the most part, the shadow side of that apple is a dark, so it's a dark against a light background. All right, so again, this is a cool, and I'm going to exaggerate it to be more cool. And then this is a warm. You'll notice that the highlight is almost white. White is a cool, and so I'm going to have to play around with that. Even though I'm going to try to maintain that light value in the highlight, I don't want it to just be white. I want it to be a warm light value, so it communicates a warm light source. Okay, so I'm just playing around with some water. I keep dipping my brush into the water so I can really thin that down. And I'm going to think about, if this shadow side is a blue-violet, and that's what my notes say over here, cool temperatures in the shadows could be a blue-violet, then what I mix in the background might be a nice little complement to that cool blue violet, and that's why I'm playing around with these desaturated neutral colors of warms. Okay, so I'm just going to play around with that, and I'm not going to worry about the apple at this point, because I know that I'm working back to front, and I'm going to come back and transfer that information onto there at a later time. I'm going to play around with as if this was a watercolor, and I'm just going to play around with some interesting blends and some textures and brush strokes. And then as soon as I get that kind of in an interesting spot, I'll probably leave it and let it dry. And then I can paint more colors on top of it and play with mixes and blends and gradations, because acrylic paint dries so fast. Now, because I'm using more thin down or transparent color, then I know that it's got a lot of water in it, and so it's going to take a little bit longer to dry. But this, unlike oil paint, this part of this painting will be dry in a matter of minutes, not hours or days or weeks, like what happens with oil paint. So again, I'm just kind of playing around with some colors, some warm colors, because I know that cool shadow side of the apple is going to be a little bit more blue-violet. So I'm playing around with some fun colors that might make that blue-violet a little bit more attractive and be a little bit more contrasty. All right. So I'm playing around with, and I hope you noticed that I started with some saturated colors, but then I mixed colors into it to make it more desaturated. I'm playing with some brush strokes, having fun with that. Back to front. The dark to light principle will come into effect here in a few minutes when I get into painting that apple. All right. So I know that it's going to be dark against light if you look at my photo reference. So now I am going to start playing around with that dark to light principle with the background. And I'm going to start framing that apple with a little bit more of a light value. And now this is one of the most I'm not going to say frustrating, but it can be frustrating when you start to think about if this was oil paint, I would just start mixing and I'd paint both objects at the same time, the background and the foreground or the apple. But that's not the way you paint it with acrylics. Okay, so that's starting to be a little bit more light value. And it is starting to be a little bit more warm, and it's going to look really good against that. Well, hopefully it'll look really good against that cool shadow side of the apple. Okay, my paint is not quite wet into wet, meaning the background is now basically dry. And it is not blending. So I've got to understand that, and I've got to maybe do a little bit of physical blending, which means I'm blending with values instead of wet paint like oil paint. Okay, now you'll notice that I'm leaving this section over here because I'm now going to start to do a little bit of a gradation. And I'm going to go a little bit darker, and I'm going to go a little bit cooler, so that that warm side of that apple, the light side of the apple, is going to look more warm if I put a cool neutral back there. All right, so that's, now I'm going to start to play with that idea. And it's going to be a little bit darker. Then I'm going to let it blend into that white area or lighter warm area. All right, I'm going to go, that's going to be a warm yellow green. That light side of the apple is going to be a warm yellow green. And so warm yellow green, I'm going to put it a little bit more blue violet back here on the violet side, so it looks good against that yellow. So I'm kind of thinking in complements at this point. Now, if you notice, I hope you can notice that there's a nice gradation or blend going on right there. And a lot of people will argue with me that you can't blend with acrylics. But I don't agree with that. I think that you can blend beautifully with acrylics if you know how to manipulate them. All right. So now we're getting into some fun blending and understanding color just a little bit more. And now when I am blending with acrylics, it's the same concept as before with oil paint. I'm just barely touching the surface of the paint or the surface of the painting. Okay. I'm going to blend. And I'm not worried about the edges of the painting. Sometimes I like a rough edge back there. But a lot of times this will be matted anyway. And so I'm just working on a bleed. Now, as I get a little bit closer down to that apple, I'm going to go a little bit more saturated with those cools. And I am going to go a little bit darker because this is a little bit more complex. So it's light against dark, but then it's dark against light with the shadow. All right, so as I get a little bit closer down to that light side of that apple, I'm gonna darken that area so that that light side of that apple will look really dark against, or really light against dark. Okay, and then I'm going to blend up, kind of cross hatch. So that's a pretty good example of dark to light and back to front right there. Okay, so if you can kind of see my mentality here, these cools and darker values in the background, and then they gradate or mix up into the neutrals and a little bit of the lighter. So I'm setting up some drama with lighting, and then they gradate from cool over to the warms so that this cool side of the apple will look more cool against those warms and those lights. And so I'm not quite happy with what's going on right in here. So I'm going to work on that a little bit more because I'm not satisfied with it. So I'm going to clean my brush. So if you were to have the mentality of this painting being a landscape, what I'm basically doing is painting the sky first. And then I will paint clouds on that sky color. And then I will take the furthest landscape element of whether it's mountains or trees or whatever, then I would paint those. Then I would advance forward until I get to the foreground elements, which might be a character or other objects or props in the image. So if you can kind of see that type of mentality, this would be the sky. Then if I had clouds, I would paint the clouds on top of the sky because they're closer to us. And then I would advance forward. So if you can just still barely see, you can still just barely see the line drawing underneath. You can see I'm going to call it a horizon line back there. I'm going to paint and get a little bit better blends with that. And then I will advance forward and paint the objects in front of that. So that's the mentality that I'm going with. And keeping in mind the temperature concept of this painting as well.